Hello, I'm Larry Johnson, and welcome to this episode of Countercurrents. Pleased today to have Doug Macgregor. Doug has been he's probably the last, let's call it dissident voice allowed on mainstream media when he was being interviewed by Tucker to be able to raise what was actually going on in Ukraine and to objectively discuss both the Russian and Ukrainian capabilities, as well as other issues that the mainstream media just doesn't want to hear from, but we're going to hear from him. So hit the like and subscribe button and stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Okay, we're now live. Do you ever read Simplicius, the thinker?
Yeah, I have read some of his work, and some of it's very good. More detailed in some cases than I can absorb, but it's usually pretty good.
So he had a piece out this week about the changing face of this war in Ukraine. That he said a lot, and I'd say I'd include myself in the group, and approached it from the standpoint of believing it would be maneuver warfare, but that the drones have completely changed that picture. So, would you first define for people what is maneuver warfare?
Maneuver warfare suggests that there's such a thing as positional advantage on the strategic and operational or tactical levels. In other words, that you move your force to a position from which it exerts superior power, influence on the battlefield. Sometimes you maneuver to a point from which you can then launch weapons against the enemy. Sometimes you maneuver to a point from which you can then launch an attack that involves a direct fire confrontation. We tend to talk a lot about maneuver warfare, but historically, Larry, we are very much a firepower army.
Mm-hmm.
So are the Marines. All this maneuver warfare stuff sounds great in theory, but in practice, we haven't been able to do it very well. You need a very, very good force on the ground with superior leadership, exceptionally well-trained, and good mobility to maneuver. The only people that have really done that well have historically been the Germans. If I were going to point to something where there's a similarity between us and the Russians, and I would also include the British in this, we are firepower armies. Now, some people say, "Well, that's not true. Look at Grant. He maneuvered out."
Yeah,
that's all crap. World War II, if you go back to it, we break out of Normandy, and everything we do depends upon air power and artillery.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately pulverize the Germans, who have no tactical air support and limited firepower, and drive them back again and again and again. And it's all linear in nature. We had a lot of World War I generals in charge in World War II. And so what did we do? We got online, we lined up the guns, brought in thousands of aircraft, and blasted the living daylights out of the Germans until they left. That was, of course, Montgomery. And we like to act as though, well, we were better than the British because we could do all of these things and they couldn't. Well, that's just not true. Yeah. We're very, very similar. So what you're seeing in Ukraine was always from the beginning. Some people call the Russian army an artillery army. I would just say that the Russians have historically always invested very heavily, not just in artillery, but the ability to strike with standoff weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you read The Icon and the Axe by James Billington talks, starts out one chapter talking about the cannon in the Kremlin, which I'm sure you've seen, the one that they stuffed the Polish Tsar in and then shot him back to Poland.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite anecdotes. I wish we had a history like that. There are a lot of people we should shoot back to somewhere else. But anyway, having said all that, he opens the chapter with this, and his point is, when Bonaparte finally comes to grips with the Russians, he's shocked because much of the Napoleonic Revolution hinged on artillery. And until he met the Russians in battle, he always had a superiority in artillery. And what he did better than most of his opponents was concentrated. Suddenly he fights the Russians and he defeats them consistently until he enters the country. That was a big mistake.
Yeah.
But he was always able to defeat the Russians when they were not yet in Russia, because the Russians could maneuver. The French could maneuver, and they could also concentrate fire. ultimately it all falls apart. But what the Russians have decided is very similar to what we decided. We're not all that well trained. We don't have superior leadership on the tactical, operational, or strategic level. So what do? We invest heavily in firepower. That's what we employ. I just get tired of people trying to sort of characterize us, Larry, as something other than that.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I was during my recent sojourn in Moscow and meeting with a variety of people. I had 2 or 3 different conversations with Lieutenant General Abdialadinov. He's he's a very impressive guy. And you remember he's the one that mounted that operation in Suja where they went in through the gas pipe.
Oh yes, yeah.
I guess that gas pipe is like 4 feet in diameter, maybe. I mean, you hunch over, and they marched 13 kilometers hunched over.
Hmm.
And it turned out initially I thought it was a bunch of young guys. They called him the veteran crew. He took a bunch of, for wartime, old guys in their 30s who were the lead on that.
Well, isn't he the one in Yakhmat that developed this flag that combines the crucifix with the crescent?
Yeah.
He's been trying to integrate Muslims with the Orthodox Christians. And thus far, he seems to have had a lot of success.
Yeah, well, he was so let's call him a survivor of the Second Chechen War. And he told me about, different family members that had been killed. And you would really, I think, enjoy sitting down and talking to him because he kept reiterating. He says, I hate war. I hate the killing. We need to get this stopped. But they were going, he was going to do militarily what was necessary to defend Russia. So it was, pretty interesting on in that regard. But where I'm going with this is we've listened to the likes of Ben Hodges, David Petraeus, Stavridis. I know, I'm sorry. I need to borrow Danny Davis's flashing warning sign about these guys. Jack King.
One of these bags they issue on the airplane when you get on, the barf bag.
Yeah.
I need a barf bag as you start talking about these people. They've lied so prolifically for so long. It's appalling.
Well, and also they speak so, let's call it, disrespectfully of the Russian military about how incompetent they are. What I was, and I talked to 2 other generals, Evgeny Bushinsky, one colonel out of Donetsk, military correspondent. All of these Russians, to a person, they spoke respectfully of the U.S. military. They didn't, I think there's ample room for them to offer criticisms, but they spoke respectfully. What is it about us that we're constantly underestimating the enemy?
Well, I think, frankly speaking, it's an old practice. It's nothing new. If we go back to World War II, before we landed in Normandy, and you look at the instructions that people received and assessments of the German military, they were on the whole very demeaning. The German is a robot. The German can't think. The German is heavily dependent upon orders from his higher headquarters. All of this, of course, is the exact opposite. That's a much better description of us, frankly. But we were imputing to the Germans all sorts of things that just were not true. In 1950, I think it was this Major General Dean. He commanded the 24th Infantry Division that was sent to Korea initially during the Korean, what we called at that point, as you know, the Korean emergency.
Yeah.
And he derided the quality of the North Koreans. And he said, I'm sure that once they see us set foot on Korean soil, they'll probably flee in disarray and fear from us. What was the basis for this? First of all, the North Koreans had all been trained by the Soviets. They had fought through the war under Soviet leadership and command with training and equipment against the Japanese. So these were tough people. They were not pushovers by any stretch of the imagination. And yet we made these kinds of uninformed statements. Now, somebody will say, well, they were just trying to build morale, but I'm afraid it's worse than that. I think it's very real. This other general, whose name escapes me at the moment, I'll think of it. He was the first commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV. This is before 1965. This is in 1963. And he was talking about the South Vietnamese military, and he said they'll utterly destroy the North Vietnamese. I'm surprised if, and the VC, I'm surprised that the VC will last a year, and predicted that the war in Vietnam would be over by January of 1964. I mean, yeah, we could just go through one sort of unimpressive general officer after the next. Very, very few smart people. Now, when Ridgway comes and sees MacArthur after the Korean War has started, and the Chinese have entered the battle,
Right.
because MacArthur eventually, as you know, is removed, but he meets with Ridgway, and Ridgway and MacArthur actually liked each other, had a lot of mutual respect. And MacArthur said, I was wrong about something. Nobody ever says that MacArthur ever admitted being wrong, but he did. He said, I was wrong something. He said, what do you mean? He said, the Chinese are not the Chinese that I saw during the Second World War. They are better trained. They're more disciplined. He said they're infiltrating along the ridge lines and the mountaintops. They're not conducting these mindless frontal assaults. He said this is a much better force than anything we saw during the Second World War. Of course, Ridgway took it on board, and he never made any ridiculous statements like that. Certainly not during the Korean War. So I think it's a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
We Americans, we're bigger, better, tougher, smarter than everybody else. And as soon as you say that, you're almost inevitably wrong.
Yeah.
But that's in the Army. When I was in the Army, you still listen to these generals that would say, if you're a battalion commander, you're the most experienced and the smartest man in your unit. Nobody has the knowledge, understanding, and experience that you do. Well, I said, if I'm the smartest man in my cavalry squadron, I'm screwed. I mean, there's no willingness to admit that, you've got 750 people in the organization, and there are people out there who are a hell of a lot smarter than you are, whether you think so or not. And if they're not smarter, they certainly have more experience than you do in a whole range of areas. It's an American thing. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah. Well, looking back at over the last 3.5 years, actually a little bit more than that, since the start of the special military operation, do you recall the sort of the first moment where you realized the lack, the inadequacy on the part of the Ukrainians? I guess I'll put it that way. That in terms of, and not to build up the Russian military, but for me, it was that first siege when they had that 24 to 40 mile column of tanks north of Kiev, and there was no, that tank column wasn't attacked systematically and destroyed. I mean, it seemed to me that would have been a sitting duck.
Well, the Russians also, at that point, were operating in the twilight zone between all-out war and, this sort of signaling exercise.
Right.
I mean, one of the things that, in April of 2022, I received a call from Mar-a-Lago. And I was asked, Doug, what do you think about what's happening in Ukraine? And I said, well, it's terrible. And he said, oh, yeah, it's really bad, but the Russians aren't doing very well. I said, well, I don't know about the Russians, but the Ukrainians are being crushed. Well, what do you mean? Everybody here says the Ukrainians are winning and they're going to win this war.
Yeah.
I said, well, they've lost their minds. I tried to explain that the Russians initially, when they went in, had these orders, which I'm sure many Russian generals were uncomfortable with, that said, don't shoot anyone. Literally, we don't want to shoot anybody. We want these Ukrainians to understand that we're there to protect the Russians, but we're not necessarily their enemy. So minimize, damage, not just collateral damage. We don't want to cover any Ukrainians. And of course, Russian generals had said, let's get them all in their barracks before they deploy. They're sitting in their barracks right now. Let's hit them all. No, said Putin. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to kill these people unnecessarily. Well, He truly believed these were Slavic Orthodox Christians and that something could be worked out. And as soon as they understood what was happening, that things would change. So I think it was pretty clear to me by April, after I looked at what happened in February and March, the Russians were not yet up to standard. There's no question about that. But the Russians also went in with a very small force.
Right.
Even though they had a very small force, they were facing a very large force, Larry. You had over 400,000 in the regular army, Ukrainian army. You had another 480,000 or so in reserves.
Right.
And they were all in the field. And yet this small Russian force continued to make progress. And I said, well, there's something radically wrong. Ukrainians aren't that good. But it wasn't until later I realized it wasn't so much the fault of the Ukrainian soldier. It was us.
Mm-hmm.
It was the U.S. Army again, along with their friends in the British Army, who were giving them terrible advice. Tactically disastrous.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the generals that you have running around now, like this man Donahue, the 4-star in Europe, the man who was a co-architect of the disaster in Afghanistan, the withdrawal. I mean, these people were giving everybody terrible advice. The Sakur, who's, what was his name? Horelli or something?
Cavoli.
Cavoli, yes. It's hard to keep up with all the guys now. They all seem to have emerged suddenly under Odierno, who I think decided he wanted to promote other people with vowels on the ends of their names. Anyway, they were giving these people terrible advice. In the meantime, the Russians were getting progressively better and better and better. And also, I saw democracy in action for the first time in Russia. Now, let me explain this. I'm not a big advocate for liberal democracy, don't get me wrong, but there was an operation in the south, down near Kherson, and this Russian brigade committed a couple of battalions of airborne troops to this operation. It didn't work well. Now, their losses were not horrendous, but they lost a lot of people, had a lot of people wounded. And these people wrote a letter to Putin, which was also passed to the newspapers, and said, this commander is an idiot. He did not do his job. He did not take the precautions that were required. We were not adequately prepared. We had not established the connectivity that we have to have with all the strike units, rocket artillery, artillery in general, and so forth, so on. Well, that man was removed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to another friend and said, that's democracy in action. Putin listened.
Yeah.
And people began to pay attention to what people on the battlefield were saying. Very positive thing. That never happens in the U.S. military. We do the opposite. We try to conceal and cover up, gross incompetence. But I was very impressed with it. And I think from that point forward, in the summer of 2022, once you get Sorovikin, who comes in there and he makes the argument for strategic elasticity, let's back off, create the right kind of defense in depth with the strike capabilities, with the ISR strike connectivity and operation. All of that, then suddenly the Russian army begins to sort of take off.
Yeah.
And becomes this almost invincible force. But what they did was essentially, and the Russians will never say this, but it's what the Germans did to the Russians in World War I. If you go back and look at the German advance, the limit of advance for the German forces, the Germans in the First World War were not stupid. They said, first of all, what are we marching into Russia for? There's nothing there but Russians.
Yeah.
What are we going there for? So they had Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Courland, the Baltic states, most of Poland, all the way down to Galicia. And that's it. They stopped. And the Russians did then what the Ukrainians have done subsequently in Ukraine in this war. They relentlessly assaulted the German defense in depth. And they were absolutely annihilated through what? Massed artillery fire.
Yeah.
And that was Sorovikin's, in my judgment, really great achievement. So from the time you build this elastic defense that is absolutely, for all intents and purposes, practically impenetrable, when you move from that forward, the Russian army is on the path to victory. There's no question about it. We never come to terms with it. Nobody looks at it. I mean, I listened to Dave Petraeus say, well, now they need to, they're really good at combined arms warfare. This guy's stuck in 1942.
Yeah.
What the hell are you talking about? This is not combined arms warfare. It's a totally different brand, a new paradigm. Well, and I think they're going to do very well. And now they're getting the new equipment. And that M1A1 tank, which I served with and utilized, it had one huge dramatic problem. The frigging engine.
Yeah.
It's a catastrophe. We knew in 1990 that you could track wherever an Army formation went that had M1 series tanks in it from low Earth orbiting satellites. They could track the thermal signature because the damn thing was burning at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. And then, of course, without much effort at all, there were something like 42 connections in and around the engine that had all these small tubes of various alloys that carried fluid. And all you had to do was shake one of those loose, the fluid hits the engine, you got a giant fire, and your engine is essentially dead meat. You had to get a new engine.
God.
Yeah. And so after the war was over, all of us, and I'm talking about at least in my part of the battlefield, first thing we said, we've got to get rid of these engines. These are a catastrophe. They're a logistical nightmare because you're drinking too much fuel too frequently. And we explained how, you can't come forward and refuel on the battlefield. Because if you refuel right next to the tanks that are up online, everything is going to go wrong. You're going to have terrible explosions and so forth. So we were taking tanks offline, would go back, refuel, and come up, but it was always hazardous. It was always a disaster. And we had to refuel too much. And one of the things that I did during that war with my unit, so I said, if we stop, and we were stopped all the time, relentlessly during the so-called offensive.
Well, why? And it stopped because of.
Well, the generals wanted to make sure that the lines were straight and the flanks were protected and nobody moved. And so every day, you would go a couple of hours, stop. Then you would sit for 2 or 3 hours and then move and then stop again after an hour of movement and wait and on and on. I mean, we sat there and watched most of the Republican Guard Corps escape on the 25th of February. My point is that we said, look, you've got to get rid of this. And I said, when we're advancing, if we stop, you shut everything down. Just shut it down because we can't afford the fuel. Well, people didn't want to do that because not my unit, but other units said, we can't do that. And I said, why the hell not? They said, well, the enemy might attack. I said, wait a minute. You look up in the sky. What do you see up there? The only thing up in the sky is the United States Air Force.
Yeah.
All the satellites belong to us. What in the hell makes you think you're going to be surprised? We got plenty of time because it would always take a few minutes to warm up the fuel and then launch the tank engine, make it work. So as a result, we never ran out of fuel. We never had a fuel problem, but you shouldn't have to do that.
Right.
I mean, I agree it's dangerous under normal circumstances, but, fortunately it wasn't at the time for us. No one would listen. And what I have seen repeatedly with the Russians is feedback. We did this, it didn't work, so we change it.
Yeah.
The other thing I saw was in these brigade formations, they would rotate battalions up to the brigade. They would stay there for whatever period of time, 48, 72, 96 hours, and then would be relieved by another battalion or 2 battalions or 3 battalions. The brigade headquarters continued to be the operational headquarters that directed the battle, but they rotated the battalions through there. So you had a maximum of fresh troops, people that had been rested, and the brigade leadership was very good because they knew what they were doing and they'd learned how to orchestrate the battle very well. And the more I saw of this sort of thing, the more impressed I was with the performance of the Russian military.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that we've learned anything from it because I can't imagine that someone like Hodges or Petraeus or any of the rest of these people can look at anything and see marked advantage, can see the benefit of doing something new and different from what we would normally do.
Can you name one area in which the Ukrainians or NATO would have an advantage over Russia in terms of weapon systems? And the reason I ask, I can't. I looked at it the other day. I said, okay, how many main battle tanks, modern, main battle tanks were built in 2024 for all of NATO and in Russia? The answer that came back was the Russians built 60 to 80. NATO built 0. I mean, all of NATO, but the South Koreans built 56 that they sold to the Poles. It's like,
Well, I'm somebody that doesn't emphasize individual technologies or platforms as much, and I don't think the Russians do as well. I think that they rapidly adapt platforms. I mean, you've seen this thing they call the Terminator.
yeah.
Brilliant device. That's something you should have in your hip pocket as a battalion commander in the battlefield. Bring up the Terminator, blast it, and move on. I mean, I would love something like that. But having said that, let me go back a little bit. In 1983, 84, 85, I was in graduate school. In 86, at one point, thanks to a friend of mine, his name was Bill Odom. I don't know if you've ever.
Yeah. No, I remember. Yeah.
And he was a mentor, so to say, intellectually, and he arranged for me to go to Andy Marshall's office, not to work for Marshall, but he said, what I want you to do is that I want you to read all the Soviet General Staff journals. So I got the super cosmic, top secret, compartmentalized everything. And I began reading through this material. And one of the things that I found very, very informative that I think we've seen again on the battlefield with the Russians, and we don't appreciate this today at all. NATO has absolutely no idea. But the Soviet historians and military analysts went back and looked at the Allied forces during the Second World War. And they compared them with Soviet forces. They also looked at the Germans, but mostly the Allies. And they said the Allies never had any chance of winning against anybody who knew what they were doing. And I said, well, that's quite an interesting comment. And of course, the Russians, at that time, the Soviets, they were very proud of their so-called victory in the war, which was by no means an easy victory at all.
Right.
They had a lot of problems. But one of the things that they did understand very well was this thing that we call unity of effort. And that meant that every organization, every formation in the Soviet military was organized, trained, and equipped in the same way. And that at every level, all the way up, from the top to the bottom, there was always one man in command. Now, sure, there were political officers there, but if you go back and look at the history, by 1942, 43, people said, screw these guys, shut up and color in the corner. And the military took over. But what they did is that they understood that you could have Polish-speaking divisions in the Soviet army, but you could not have any Polish Army Corps, any Polish formations, armies, or anything else inside the Soviet army. Everybody had to be Sovietized.
Right.
The Germans didn't do that either. The Germans treated their Hungarian, Romanian, Italian allies very carefully. I mean, people don't realize this. They let them do largely what they wanted to do, and the Soviets said, well, that's stupid. Then they're more burden and an asset. Well, when you look at NATO, as I try to explain to people militarily, it's like a herd of cats.
Yes.
16 cats. Come on into the room. And you see 8 cats never come through the door. Why won't the cats come through the door? Well, this is the nature of NATO. Well, that more than anything else, the absence of a unified military command structure, the absence of uniformity in training, tactics, organization, doctrine, that more than anything else is death on the battlefield. So if we were to face the Russians at this point, we would be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, well, their concept of the general staff, we had the joint chiefs of staff, but that's not a, as you know, that's that's a domestic version of NATO, I guess.
Well, the other thing is the Soviets and the Russians do this now. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. And you're spot on about the Russian general staff. The Russians, even under the czars, were very sensitive to the requirement to find high human capital as commanders and also staff officers and bring them in and take care of them and nurture them. Now, it was much better under the Soviets than it had been under the czars. Soviets did a much better job, but then again, they were pretty damn desperate. If you look at the people at the top that are making all the plans, and all these names, I didn't come prepared to talk about it, but in my book, Margin of Victory, you can read a chapter about it, and I cover a lot of this on the Soviet side. But the people that you end up running the show out of Moscow as one group. Very, very, very skilled, highly intelligent, well trained, eye for detail for everything that's required, as good as the German general staff.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have something else that happens on the battlefield because they'd had so many losses and so many reverses. They suddenly picked people that had the steadiness of nerve and character and determination to stay and fight come hell or high water. They then become what I call the long ball hitters. So when there's a decision, we're going to have an and I have a whole chapter on the destruction of Army Group Center. And when they make the decision, we're going to launch offensives in these areas, you bring in these headquarters that will command the various armies and fronts. And you have one command structure, two command structures, three, divided up into three, say all going into Eastern Poland or Western White Russia. And these are the best, most experienced, competent battlefield commanders who are simultaneously at the top, led by clearly the very best and most competent general staff officers.
Yeah.
We never did anything like that. We don't do anything like that now. We promote Billy Bob because Billy Bob, he's a good guy and a real war fighter. You get a lot of Billy Bobs. Or we promote somebody else for some other damn stupid reason. And there are no tests. There are no examinations. One of the things that Putin did after he took over, and he went through this big effort to reform the army. It failed. So he stopped, said, okay, that's not worked. We're going to change it. We're going to do something else. They set up a separate school for commanders. And that place was designed to sift out who was an idiot and who was actually competent. We don't make those efforts.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have all these sort of pre-digested future great men that were somebody's aide de camp, somebody's chief executive officer, somebody's speechwriter.
Yeah, the politics of it. I mean, I scripted exercises for JSOC and SOCOM over 23 years. So, when I started, I think Garrison was like a lieutenant colonel or a colonel at the time, and I just, you saw how politics played a more important role than actual competence, I guess is what I'm saying.
But at the same time, let's be frank, we know that even if you do most things right, most of the time, things can still go wrong.
Yes. Yeah.
But you still have a better shot at recovering from the mistake if you have competent people than if you do not. And so this business of watching offensive after offensive after offensive launched by the Ukrainians into the teeth of these Russian defenses, without regard to the paradigm shift in warfare, the connectivity between the overhead surveillance, terrestrial and satellite-based, and all of the strike systems, which, as you know, on the Russian side are being masked.
Right.
Not necessarily hub to hub as you had during the Second World War. No, they're dispersed, but they're all masked effectively. And then you have a change in the force so that the force is not sitting there in World War II style fronts. They're dispersed, but they can concentrate and then disperse again as required. All of these things are happening. And what are we doing? We're refighting World War II.
Well, how do you explain, because reflecting on your education, as from West Point on, were you ever trained to say, okay, here are some defensive lines, they are in depth, and were you ever taught to attack those without air cover, air power?
Yeah, effectively we were.
Really?
We were pushed into that at the National Training Center. They would simulate air power. And remember, this is before the precision paradigm really struck.
Yeah.
I mean, this is in the 80s, early 90s. And there was, I remember standing at the National Training Center with a general officer who was actually quite smart. His name was Boyd, Maury Boyd. He was a one-star, an artilleryman. And we're watching this unit being decimated by little men with lasers on the side of a hill that is just peppered with boulders. And he looked at this and shook his head, and I saw him shake his head. I said, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, good artillery would turn all of those boulders on the side of the hill into shrapnel All you have to do is airburst. You kill everybody up there who's got a little shoulder-fired laser that is destroying all the armor that's down in the valley. He said, absolutely right. He said, I just take the top of that hill away. Oh, we don't simulate that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we ended up, I think, imparting a lot of bad lessons to people. And if you impart bad lessons, they tend to be internalized. Go back to 2003 when we went into Iraq. You'll remember this. We suddenly decided, and I mean suddenly, it was really Wallace and Petraeus at the time on the ground. Wallace was the corps commander. Petraeus had the 101st. Said, well, let's launch a deep attack with attack helicopters against the Iraqis. Well, first of all, why would you do it? What are you launching your deep attack against? Well, are you looking for some massive armor concentration? That was never quite clear. Ultimately, what they did is that they decided, we're going to do it. We're going to do it tonight. Let's get everybody going or something. Less than 24 hours, half the one battalion out of the 3 that were supposed to attack got lost. It was nighttime. They didn't know where they were. The other 2 battalions end up flying over Najaf, where they see all these lights, and they park in the air. And so the Iraqi Arabs come out with their weapons and start shooting all the helicopters that are in the air. Well, the question was, what are they looking for? They were looking for something they'd seen in a war game, something they'd been taught at the NTC, exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
Well, the second or third echelon, we want to get at them. These are Iraqis.
Yeah. Yes.
The Soviet army. So what the hell do you think you're actually doing? Nobody paid attention to it except to say, this is really bad. I guess they had a couple of aircraft shot down, but all of the aircraft were out of the action after that. They'd taken so much damage from small arms fire, they couldn't be used. Well, if you were realistic about deep operations, you wouldn't conduct it with a helicopter anyway.
Right.
What is on these people's minds? I mean, that much you could have learned from good simulations. I remember talking to a smart aviator who said, well, we can send 2 or 3 aircraft up there, but if we send more than that, it'll light up the air defense and they'll all be shot to pieces. So I said, okay, that sounds good to me. What can we get them to do to light up the air defense so we can destroy it? And we started working on that, but that was not at work. It was simulation. This was the argument that Percival, the general who surrendered Singapore, made after he surrendered. And he talked about, we had learned on exercise not to commit our reserve until the conditions mandated it. Well, he was went into all of these peacetime operations. The problem was that Yamashita, Japanese commander with his small force, motoring down Malaysia towards Singapore, didn't play by the rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
They behaved very differently, and he was completely unprepared for anything that he had never seen. I think that's a huge problem in the English-speaking world in our armed forces.
Well, let me ask you about, we're coming to the end of this in terms of time. How long can we stay deployed like we are in the Caribbean right now? This the cocked hammer. Because I've been saying we can't do that indefinitely.
I would say normally 6 to 8 weeks. And again, then where do you pull in? You've got to replenish. You know that from your experience.
Yeah.
Replenishing at sea, it takes you so far. You have to have ports. And then you have a lot of people who become very tired, and your edge is not what it was when you started. So you do reach the point where you need to pull a trigger or pull back. Now, I don't know what the admirals are telling President Trump or Secretary Hegseth, but I'm sure somebody in the Navy has made these points. And the same thing applies not as rigorously to people on the ground up in Puerto Rico. I mean, I'm sure you could sit around, enjoy the good weather and so forth, but you too can become slovenly and sloppy if you're there for God knows how long. Right now, I guess we have a lot of people pouring into, what is it, Trinidad?
Yeah, Trinidad and Tobago.
Tobago, yeah. So, and of course, if you were dealing with a near peer, as we like to say it, I just say somebody with any kind of capability, Trinidad and Tobago would be in bad shape right now.
Yeah.
I mean, why wait around for these people to get their act together and attack? And I understand they have Iranian drones, and they've actually flown some of them all the way up to Puerto Rico. So, this is a different world. This is the world that Russians operate in, where there's no such thing as invisibility.
Right.
We still behave as though there is.
Yeah. In fact, in reflecting on that, going back, I remember when they first got the ability to do secure video teleconference on, like laptops. It was like, watching a caveman discover fire, them sitting there looking at it and, and grunting. And then as the drones, we, in our, it seems our drone program's frozen in time because, with JSOC, they used to have all these drones that would be up monitoring a particular area, and then they'd find somebody that they wanted to kill. And then, it'd go through all the lawyers and say, launch, we called it kill TV. But that's a whole different, what the Russians have produced now on the battlefield in Ukraine is, I don't think any of us envisioned that back in 2022 or even 2023.
Well, I was astonished when I saw this new drone. I've forgotten the nomenclature for it that the Russians have, which has a spool of very, very fine fiber optic cable. And now the last I heard, they could go out to 40 kilometers with this, and I'm now being told they can go further. This, of course, was to defeat jamming and other countermeasures, and it's very effective. I don't think we're even close to something like that.
Yeah, no, and that the initial Shahed was, my understanding is the Iranians downed a CIA drone back in like 2012, and then they reversed engineered it, which is what then they were sharing it with the Russians. But now, like you said, it's advanced. How long do you think the Ukrainians can hold out? I'm not going to hold you to being a prophet on this, but
no, well, I'm not a prophet anyway. I think the Ukrainian front is in ruins at this point. What's happened in Pokrovsk is very, very serious. People in the West don't understand how serious it is. And you've seen these endless columns of Ukrainian soldiers marching into captivity.
Yeah.
And the sad part is several Russian soldiers have reported that a lot of these young men have only been in uniform for a week.
Yeah.
I mean, this is absurd. What I think is inhumane is the insistence that Washington and its allies are making that these people continue to fight.
Mm-hmm.
It should be the opposite. Humanity demands an end to this. We've got to rescue whatever is left of the so-called Ukrainian nation before it's extinct. Nobody seems to consider this a possibility, and everybody says, well, what's it going to look like when it's over? Whatever the Russians want it to look like.
Yeah.
You're going to wake up and smell the coffee, or at least smell what you're shoveling if you're in the West, because they've won.
Yeah. Well, that I'll close with this. I got to interview the former prime minister of Ukraine, Azarov. He was prime minister from 2010 to 2014. And he shared one statistic with me that was just, I was shocked. He said when he took office, there were 57 million Ukrainians in the country. He said now there's 20 million. And it's like, good Lord.
Well, according to my German sources, the Ukrainians that are in the West have no intention of ever going back.
Yeah. Hey, Doug, thanks for taking the time. I know you were a man in great demand, but appreciate being able to, take this conversation a little bit different direction than the normal, drumbeat of the daily events.
Yeah, this was enjoyable. I appreciate it. Thank you for doing it, Larry.
Well, thanks for your knowledge and insight. So, okay, take care. Hope you enjoyed that. If you did, hit the like and subscribe button, and tell your friends, share it around, and I've got some other material on countercurrents that I think you'll enjoy. So, until next time, I'm Larry Johnson, and this is Countercurrents. Thanks so much.